They dazzled millions from the silver screen. Flawless, radiant, seemingly touched by the gods themselves. But behind the carefully constructed glamour of Hollywood's golden age lurked secrets that studio publicists worked overtime to bury. Beneath the powder, the perfectly angled lighting, and the meticulously tailored costumes were real human bodies, scarred, asymmetrical, broken, and rebuilt. These were the men and women who transformed their deepest vulnerabilities into box office gold. What the cameras never showed you might surprise you. Here are 10 Golden Age icons who hid severe physical conditions from the world. Number 1. Claudette Colbert, the one-sided star. If you ever noticed that Claudette Colbert always seemed to favor a particular angle in every single film she made, you weren't imagining things. And neither were the directors who quietly accepted her unusual demands. Colbert, the French-born actress who captivated audiences throughout the 1930s and 1940s, possessed one of the most recognizable faces in cinema history. But here's the truth that the studio system worked hard to conceal. Claudette Colbert was convinced, and not entirely without reason, that the left side of her face was significantly less attractive than the right. In fact, she believed her left profile was so unflattering that she made it a contractual stipulation in her deals that she would only be filmed from her right side. Directors who pushed back quickly discovered that Colbert was not a woman to be trifled with. She reportedly had a bump on the left side of her nose that she considered disfiguring, and the asymmetry of her facial features was something she was acutely, painfully aware of from very early in her career. The studio lighting crews at Paramount became specialists in constructing elaborate setups simply to ensure Colbert's preferred side was always catching the light most favorably. On sets where the geography of a scene seemed to demand she face left, entire staging plans were reworked. Co-stars learned quickly. Directors sighed and complied. The result, paradoxically, was a kind of photographic consistency that made her look almost supernaturally polished on screen. What audiences interpreted as effortless elegance was actually the product of meticulous, exhausting, behind-the-scenes negotiation. Colbert's insistence was so well known within industry circles that it became something of a running joke among Hollywood crews, though nobody dared laugh within her earshot. Remarkably, her self-consciousness about her appearance never translated into any visible anxiety on screen, only into a luminous, one-sided perfection that became her signature. Number 2. Bette Davis, eyes that told only part of the story. Bette Davis had perhaps the most famous eyes in the history of motion pictures. Kim Carnes even sang about them decades after Davis had left her peak years behind. But those extraordinary, wide, almost unsettlingly intense eyes were not simply a gift of genetics deployed for dramatic effect. They were, in part, a symptom of a genuine medical condition that Davis battled throughout much of her life and career. Davis suffered from what medical professionals believe was exophthalmos, a condition in which the eyeballs protrude forward from the eye socket, often associated with hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease. The condition caused her eyes to appear larger and more prominent than was typical, creating that signature wide-eyed look that cinematographers and directors eventually learned to weaponize for maximum dramatic impact. But the reality behind those eyes was far less glamorous. Davis dealt with significant health struggles related to her thyroid throughout her career, experiencing episodes of fatigue, weight fluctuation, and physical discomfort that she largely kept hidden from the public. The studios, of course, had no interest in publicizing the medical realities. They were far more invested in mythologizing the look itself. Davis, to her immense credit and perhaps her greatest act of personal alchemy, did exactly the same. She took what could have been a source of self-consciousness and transformed it into her most powerful tool. She weaponized those protruding, restless eyes to convey depths of emotion that other actresses of her era simply could not reach. She stared down cameras, co-stars, and directors alike with a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere acting technique. In a very real sense, Bette Davis looked the world directly in the eye and dared it to look away first. The condition that might have sidelined a lesser talent became the foundation of a legend. Number 3. Lon Chaney Sr., the man of 1,000 painful faces. If any single figure in the history of Hollywood embodies the concept of physical transformation taken to its most extreme and punishing limits, it is Lon Chaney Sr., the man they called the Man of 1,000 Faces. While Chaney is remembered primarily for his extraordinary makeup artistry, the less discussed truth is that many of his most memorable physical transformations were accomplished through methods that caused him genuine, documented physical harm. For his role as Quasimodo in the 1923 silent adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Chaney wore a plaster hump on his back that weighed somewhere between 50 and 70 pounds, depending on the account you consult. He wore a harness that kept his body bent at a tortured angle throughout filming, reportedly causing real damage to his spine and causing him chronic pain that persisted long after production wrapped. For The Penalty, released in 1920, Chaney played a double amputee, and he achieved the effect by having his legs strapped painfully behind him for extended periods of shooting, cutting off circulation and causing genuine physical distress. Chaney's dedication to physical reality in his performances went beyond method acting into something closer to deliberate self-punishment. What makes Chaney's story particularly poignant is that this willingness to embrace and embody physical suffering was rooted in something deeply personal. He was raised by parents who were both deaf-mutes, and he developed his extraordinary gift for physical expression. Every gesture amplified, every facial contortion made to carry meaning. Precisely because verbal communication was not an option in his childhood home. Physical deformity, in Chaney's universe, was never something to be hidden. It was something to be inhabited, explored, and transformed into art. He remains, decades after his death from throat cancer in 1930, perhaps the most fearless physical performer Hollywood has ever produced. Number 4. Marlene Dietrich, The Architecture of Illusion. Marlene Dietrich was not merely a movie star. She was a carefully engineered visual phenomenon, a woman who understood the mechanics of image-making with the precision of an architect and the patience of a sculptor. What few of her adoring fans understood while watching her smolder across the screen was the extraordinary lengths to which Dietrich went to conceal and compensate for features she considered physically deficient. Dietrich had a notoriously round face that she believed undermined the angular, chiseled look that defined her personal aesthetic. To combat this, she reportedly had her upper back molars removed to create the appearance of more dramatically hollow cheekbones, a procedure that caused her ongoing dental issues throughout her life. The famous Dietrich cheekbones that made cinematographers weep with gratitude were, in part, a surgical achievement as much as a natural one. Beyond her dental modifications, Dietrich was said to suffer from significant varicose veins in her legs, a painful circulatory condition that nonetheless did not stop her from appearing in stunning gowns and form-fitting costumes that showcased her legs as one of her most celebrated physical assets. Elaborate stocking techniques, careful lighting from below, and strategic costume choices all contributed to concealing the condition from public view. Dietrich herself was the chief engineer of her own illusion, studying her image with a relentlessness that bordered on obsession. She famously controlled her lighting arrangements on set, often directing the placement of key lights herself over the objections of cinematographers. She understood that her screen persona was a construction, and she treated its maintenance as a full-time occupation layered on top of her actual full-time occupation of being a movie star. The gap between the ethereal figure audiences saw on screen and the complicated, physically imperfect woman behind that image was vast, and Dietrich spent her entire career making sure that gap remained invisible. Number 5. Rock Hudson, the body that carried secrets. Rock Hudson was, by any conventional measure, one of the most physically ideal men Hollywood ever produced. Tall, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and possessed of a smile that seemed to have been specially manufactured for Technicolor cinematography, Hudson appeared to be the living embodiment of mid-century masculine perfection. And for decades, the machinery of the studio system worked tirelessly to ensure that the public image matched the constructed reality. What was concealed, of course, went far beyond physical imperfection in the traditional sense. Hudson's most significant hidden reality was his HIV-positive status, which he kept secret from the public until 1985, a disclosure that sent shockwaves through Hollywood and the broader American cultural landscape. But in the years leading up to that announcement, the physical deterioration caused by AIDS-related illness was something that Hudson and those around him worked desperately to hide from cameras and from the public. During the filming of the television series Dynasty in 1984 and 1985, Hudson was visibly unwell, having lost significant weight and showing other signs of serious illness. Co-stars and crew members noticed that something was wrong, but in the culture of that era, particularly within the studio system's deeply ingrained habit of image management, questions were neither asked nor answered. Hudson's physical decline was minimized, explained away, and hidden behind camera angles and makeup until it could no longer be concealed. His eventual public disclosure fundamentally changed the conversation about AIDS in America, putting a face to the epidemic that millions of Americans had previously been able to distance themselves from. The irony is profound. The man whose entire public existence had been constructed around the concealment of his true self ended his life by making one of the most important public disclosures in Hollywood history. Number 6. Vivien Leigh, the madness behind the beauty. Vivien Leigh possessed what many critics and contemporaries described simply as the most beautiful face in the history of cinema, a claim that remains genuinely difficult to argue with even from the distance of several decades. Scarlett O'Hara, Blanche Dubois. These were roles that demanded and received a particular quality of luminous, brittle beauty that Leigh delivered with heartbreaking precision. But the brittleness was not merely an acting choice. Vivien Leigh suffered throughout her adult life from what would today be diagnosed as bipolar disorder, a condition that in the 1940s and 1950s was poorly understood, inadequately treated, and considered deeply shameful. Her manic episodes were reported to be extreme, involving days without sleep, erratic and sometimes frightening behavior, and a loss of the careful self-control that her professional life demanded. Her depressive episodes were correspondingly devastating, leaving her physically debilitated and emotionally unreachable. Compounding this was her battle with tuberculosis, which she contracted in the early 1940s and which recurred periodically throughout her life, causing chronic fatigue, respiratory difficulties, and physical weakness that had to be hidden during filming through exhausting layers of makeup, careful scheduling, and the determined cooperation of directors who admired her enough to work around her limitations. The physical toll of uncontrolled bipolar disorder on the human body is significant. Sleep deprivation, weight fluctuation, and the side effects of the crude treatments available in that era all left their marks. On screen, none of this was visible. What cameras captured instead was the extraordinary phenomenon of a woman whose inner chaos somehow refined itself in the act of performance into something approaching perfection. Leigh's tragedy was inseparable from her genius, and the physical suffering she endured in private found no outlet except through the wounded, magnificent characters she brought to life. Number 7. Gary Cooper, the cowboy who could barely stand. Gary Cooper was the quintessential American screen hero, laconic, upright, morally uncomplicated, and physically commanding in a way that seemed to belong specifically to the wide-open landscapes of the Western genre. Audiences watched him ride, shoot, and stride through the American frontier with an ease that looked entirely natural. What they could not see was the physical reality underneath that composed exterior. By the middle of his career, Gary Cooper was a man in significant and chronic pain. Cooper suffered from a serious hip injury sustained in a car accident in the late 1920s, and the damage worsened considerably over the years as he continued to perform physically demanding roles without allowing adequate recovery time. He also developed severe chronic back problems that caused him persistent pain throughout much of his working life, conditions that were exacerbated rather than helped by the physical demands of riding horses and performing action sequences. By the time Cooper was making some of his most celebrated films, including High Noon in 1952, for which he won his second Academy Award, he was also dealing with a duodenal ulcer and the early stages of the prostate cancer that would eventually kill him. During the production of High Noon, Cooper was reportedly in significant physical discomfort throughout filming, and director Fred Zinnemann observed that the actor's visible pain and exhaustion actually contributed to the authenticity of his performance. A sheriff who looked genuinely burdened, genuinely worn down, genuinely mortal. Cooper died in 1961 at the age of 60, just weeks after receiving an honorary Oscar that was accepted on his behalf by James Stewart, who wept openly at the podium. The hero of the American screen had been quietly suffering for years, and almost nobody outside his immediate circle had known. Number 8. Josephine Baker. The Scars Beneath the Sequins. Josephine Baker was a revolutionary force, as a performer, as an activist, as a symbol of a particular kind of defiant, unapologetic black femininity that the world of the 1920s and 1930s was entirely unprepared to encounter. She dazzled audiences in Paris and beyond with an electrifying physicality that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitation, dancing with a speed and precision and raw animal joy that left audiences breathless and critics struggling for adequate language. What Baker concealed beneath those spectacular costumes and beneath that incandescent stage presence was a body that had endured extraordinary physical trauma. Baker underwent numerous surgeries throughout her life, some cosmetic, some reconstructive, that left significant scarring across her body. The nature of several of these procedures has been the subject of ongoing historical research, but what is documented is that Baker's relationship with her own body was complex and sometimes painful, shaped by the racism she had experienced from childhood onward and by a deeply internalized pressure to conform to beauty standards that were not designed with her in mind. She also suffered a near-fatal illness in 1941, collapsing in Casablanca from what was reported as a serious internal infection that left her hospitalized for an extended period and temporarily ended her performing career. The physical recovery was lengthy and genuinely uncertain, and for a time it appeared she might not return to the stage at all. That she did return, and returned with undiminished power, speaks to something beyond mere physical resilience. Baker inhabited her body with a defiance that was itself a political act, refusing to allow either racism or physical vulnerability to dim the extraordinary light she had decided to share with the world. Her scars, visible and invisible, were the map of a life lived at the absolute fullest. Number 9. James Cagney, the dancer who danced through damage. James Cagney is remembered primarily as one of the great tough guys of Hollywood cinema. Quick, dangerous, electric with compressed energy, the kind of screen presence that made audiences sit forward in their seats without quite knowing why. What is less universally remembered is that Cagney was, before anything else, a dancer. A genuinely gifted, technically accomplished dancer whose physicality was the foundation of everything he brought to the screen, including the coiled menace of his gangster roles. What Cagney concealed throughout much of his career was the cumulative physical damage that his extraordinarily demanding performance style inflicted on his body over decades. He suffered from chronic knee problems that worsened significantly over the years, the result of a lifetime of jumping, spinning, and the kind of explosive physical movement that his performances demanded. The knees that had propelled him so spectacularly through his famous stair dance in Yankee Doodle Dandy were, by the middle of his career, causing him genuine and chronic pain that required careful management between productions. Cagney also suffered in his later years from diabetes and arteriosclerosis, conditions that affected his circulation and his energy levels significantly. There was additionally a documented tremor, now believed by some medical historians to have been an early symptom of Parkinson's disease, that Cagney worked carefully to conceal in his later performances through particular performance choices and careful collaboration with directors who understood what he needed. His 1981 comeback in Ragtime was achieved despite significant physical limitations that he managed with characteristic toughness and professionalism. Cagney never sought sympathy and never discussed his physical struggles publicly with any degree of candor. He was too much of a professional and perhaps too much of the character he had spent a lifetime playing to admit that any of it hurt. Number 10. Elizabeth Taylor, The Perfect Face and Its Hidden Price. Elizabeth Taylor is perhaps the most straightforward candidate for any list concerned with Golden Age beauty. Violet eyes, a face of almost mathematical symmetry, a figure that seemed to have been designed specifically to make cinematographers feel that their professional lives had been worthwhile. But beneath that legendary exterior was a body that was, from remarkably early in her life, engaged in a near-constant battle with serious physical illness and injury. Taylor was born with a genetic mutation called dystichiasis, a condition in which a double row of eyelashes grows from the eyelid. In most individuals, this causes significant irritation and discomfort, but in Taylor's remarkable case, it was widely credited with contributing to the unusual depth and intensity of her eyes. Nature, in her instance, had turned a medical anomaly into an aesthetic miracle. However, Taylor's physical challenges extended far beyond this fortunate genetic quirk. She suffered a severe back injury during the filming of National Velvet as a teenager, and the damage to her spine was serious enough to require surgery and to cause her chronic pain for the rest of her life. Over the course of her career, she underwent more than 30 surgeries for her back, for a tracheotomy performed when she nearly died from pneumonia during the filming of Cleopatra in 1961, and for numerous other conditions that accumulated over a lifetime of physical crisis. She battled addiction to prescription pain medications, a dependency that grew directly from her legitimate need to manage chronic physical pain. Her near death during Cleopatra left her with a permanent scar on her throat that she managed in subsequent public appearances with careful costume and jewelry choices. Taylor's extraordinary life force, which radiated so powerfully from the screen, was matched by the extraordinary determination it took to keep that body functioning. She was, in a very literal sense, more than her beauty. She was a human being of remarkable endurance, who simply happened to be the most beautiful person in any room she ever entered. The golden age of Hollywood was built on illusion, but the stories of these remarkable individuals remind us that the most compelling illusions are constructed from the rawest human materials: pain, determination, the absolute refusal to allow physical limitation to define the boundaries of a life. These men and women did not hide their struggles because they were ashamed, though shame was certainly part of the era's brutal calculus. They hid them because the show, as they understood it with absolute conviction, had to go on. And go on it did, magnificently, unforgettably, and at a cost the audience never fully knew